Hi, everyone, and welcome back to part two of the Epstein deep dive. Thanks so much for your engagement with part one. I think it's really good to see that people are looking at this through the lens of a system, which is what we wanted to do in the first place. We wanted to make it clear how this web is working, how power operates, and how ultimately people are at the bottom of this system. We're looking at a kind of an unseen, unknown system operating in the shadows. And we talked about how the reach of this was global. And we talked about how we were going to bring this home to Ireland, because I don't know if many of you remember Dara's article in Counterpunch about a year ago, where he wrote a brilliant piece about Ireland's complicity in genocide. And at the time, it floored lots of us because it was so thick with information about just how complicit we were. And I think why it had such an impact was because we tend to think of Ireland as a bit more innocent. And we don't tend to think we are as involved with the great corruption that goes on in the world. But what we are learning from what the Epstein files have revealed about the relationship between the most powerful people in the world and Ireland tells a darker story. We don't just have the information, the most recent information, which is a witness's testimony, or a victim's testimony, I should say, that she was trafficked to Ireland. And Epstein landed in Ireland multiple times. So that's in the public awareness at the moment, with very little known about the details of it. But what we want to do today is go back to the beginning, similar to what we did in the first podcast, and look at how Ireland's power systems were built, by who, and in what context, and how it connects to the people we spoke about in episode one. Dara, hello, and how does that sound? And what would you add to that?
Hello. Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, I think it's important just to try to keep the focus on this system, this network as part of a wider strategy and how we can again just understand Ireland as a node in the system as best as we can, as ultimately what should we all be trying to do is to try and essentially weed out this disease from where we can and to again focus on our own complicity because once we start pointing fingers at faraway places, it takes away our agency slightly. So within the globalized economic system, regardless of sort of how good anyone's intentions might be, is that we ultimately have a sort of relational aspect to what is happening around us, and in particular today, that's the United States, and historically has always been Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So when we sort of looked at this network in the first episode, what were sort of some of the key things just to keep in mind for our analysis? The first one was that this is a network of organized crime.
Yes.
And that's something we need to start understanding about the global economy, about our democracies, about how the world actually operates, is that a very sophisticated network of organized crime has an extremely outsized role in the goings on our planet.
Yes.
And the second part was really the Cold War aspect to this network. Um, and when I say Cold War, it's not necessarily a case of the United States and the Soviet Union that a lot of people would assume. but it is essentially a class war.
Hmm.
And the class that are most organized in fighting this war is really this hyper core of organized criminals against the people of the earth. And
Exactly.
this Cold War looks very different depending on the sort of location. But from the very start of this network, we see an explicit sort of anti-liberationist, anti-communist, anti-anything that opposes the interests of this class of parasites up at the top of the hierarchy. And this
Mhm.
explains a lot of the behavior of the system as a whole, I would say.
Yes, this system needs freedom to extract. It needs freedom to exploit. And so that is why it has designed these systems. We might put labels like neoliberalism on them, which ultimately says that the market, let the market dictate how society functions. There's no need to intervene. We hear all this philosophy about, the invisible hand of the market and
Mm,
all this nonsense about how if you concentrate wealth at the top, it'll piss down on the poor. Sorry, I think the phrase is trickle down on the poor. But that's essentially what it means. You can have little scraps of our piss that trickles. And it's just like how we've come to accept a system that impoverishes so many, creates huge problems in society. And not just that, but there's also a secondary system running to that. Like what you said to me during the week, Dara, Epstein taught these people in his network something that you don't learn in university or college. He taught them how to operate, quote unquote, in the real system, which is where the big money is made, which is the likes of human trafficking, which is a massive industry, and people mightn't really know the figures involved in that. And you pulled out some really good ones here. This is only the data that's available. Obviously, this couldn't possibly be all the data because this is a criminal system. 236 billion per year in profits from forced labor in the private economy. It isn't just forced labor that trafficking is done for. We also know it's about commercial sex and other such things. And when you compare that figure, 236 billion, to like the music industry, look at the music industry. It's, what is it? Global recorded music revenues in 2024, 29.6. It's a fraction, it's less than half. Um,
Yeah, it's
so that'll give you,
really we don't have any idea about the scale or the sophistication of this industry. You can
yeah,
call it an industry.
yeah,
236 billion just in profits.
yes,
It's really we can't really even imagine the size of this. And yeah, as you say, the music industry, if you combine the music industry and the film industry, and these are just examples of industries that people are very familiar with because of how present they are in our daily lives. But if you can
yeah,
just think of these two industries and how often they touch you, how much you might know about this industry, how many people might be involved. Again, even in Ireland, which doesn't really have a music industry, everyone will at least come into contact in some way with music or film.
yep.
Yet these two industries combined make up only about 60 billion in revenue, not even profits,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is about a quarter of what we know about regarding profits just from human trafficking.
That's phenomenal, and that was really a revelation to me. And as you say, this is just the data that we have. Um, so there is another system at play. It's trafficking and it's dealing, and Epstein was very influential in teaching people how to play that system. But in terms of
Yeah.
tracing Ireland's the root of, Ireland's issue or Ireland's contribution part in this system of human trafficking. This is very, it's shocking, really, to discover the scale of it. But before we get into, or should we start there, Dara? Should we start in the 50s with the mother and babies homes or the exploitation of children that we know happened in the north?
Yeah, so yeah, just to maybe as well, before we go into things properly, just to give people also maybe an idea of kind of how we did some of this research and how they can maybe go and do some of their own, as well as
Yeah.
also just to credit some of the people whose research has been incredibly valuable in this. And from episode one, a lot of that research, if not most of it, came from a woman called Whitney Webb, uh,
Mm.
who has written two brilliant books called One Nation Under Blackmail. And she really maps out this web and this network from the beginning up until the present day. She has a lot of videos on YouTube and things as well that I would really recommend.
Hmm.
Then, when we look at the Irish context, so there's a few different sources that we looked at. The first of which was a guy called David Burke, and
Hmm.
he also was depending on a lot of research done by somebody called Robin Bryan. Um, then also looking at the reports that were done by the Irish government on the mother and baby homes, and also looking at some books. Also, there's a guy called Mike Millot, I think is how to pronounce his name, but I'm not sure. And he wrote also a book called, I think it was um, banished babies,
Hmm.
the black market babies, something
Yeah.
along those lines. So when we started to do more research on this in the Irish context, so the first thing that really jumped out was a place called Kincora in Belfast, which we
Mm.
mentioned in the last podcast. And why did it sort of ring alarm bells, and why does this look like another node in this network? So, when we looked at this in the first episode, we saw incredibly close links between organized crime and intelligence agencies.
Yes.
And this sort of nexus that exists between the United States, England, and Israel.
Yes.
So these are sort of the three parts of the nexus. You also do see some involvement, particularly as the context is in the Cold War, of involvement of Soviet spies in this network as well at times. But basically, the collaboration is happening between England, the US, and Israel.
Hmm.
So when we look at Kincora, so this was a huge scandal that happened really around 1980. Kincora opened up, I believe, in 1971. And this was really a hotspot of child abuse and pedophilia. And it involves several essentially confirmed MI5, MI6 agents. It links to British paramilitary groups in the north that
Hmm.
are unionists, that are sectarian, and also have links to something that's called British Israelism. And we see that the hub of this seems to be in Kincora and Belfast, but it spreads actually across the border as well as throughout the north. So I think this is maybe the best place to start, just to give sort of an example of this specific network in Ireland.
Hmm.
And a couple of names that are just important for us to remember from episode one. The first of which is this man called Roy Cohn.
Yes.
And he was really the precursor to Epstein, the person that Epstein kind of replaced in the system in the
Hmm.
mid 1980s or so. And he was really responsible for a lot of the fleshing out of this network and its deeper integration into the intelligence system. So Roy Cohn, just as a reminder, was perhaps Trump's closest confidant. He was his lawyer and was the lawyer of a lot of very powerful men in the United States. And Roy Cohn, again, was explicitly sort of the leader of the Jewish Anti-Communist League. He was the lawyer for this guy McCarthy, in the States in the 50s, which McCarthyism, essentially this Red Scare
Arose
tactic in
from.
the
He's a
United
crucial
States.
piece, and many people would say that he groomed Trump. He was
Exactly.
Trump's mentor, and he saw great potential in Donald Trump. Yeah.
Exactly. So he was a key part in this group, and with that, who else was he extremely close to and was in this sort of sex blackmail ring alongside? Again, essentially from the start, is this man, J Edgar Hoover, who was
Yes.
the FBI
Founder of the FBI.
founder
Yeah.
and the director of the FBI for his entire life, more than 40 years. This man essentially was the FBI.
Yes.
Okay. So when we look at King Cora, so this was being run by British intelligence and was used as one of these honeypot schemes that was being used to blackmail people in the north in order to control them and have them carry out operations, activities, intelligence gathering, so that British intelligence interests are being served on the island of Ireland.
Yeah, and there are reports about how the British intelligence set up camp in a nearby hotel to surveil King Cora. And that echoes back to similar operations that we see happening in the United States and Canada, where the CIA literally set up these traps in apartment buildings with those single-sided mirrors, where they literally record people committing these crimes. So you see kind of these parallel systems working with intelligence companies at the heart of them, exploiting children.
Exactly. So in Kincora, probably the most famous victim within this is a boy called, well, a man called Richard Kerr, who was a boy at the time.
Yeah.
And he's given a lot of testimony that went into David Burke's analysis on this system. And he also mentioned specifically a man called Roy Cohn,
Yes.
who comes to Belfast, takes Richard Kerr with him to Venice, essentially as a sex slave on a trip to Venice. And
With help from multiple people who escort him to Venice. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then brings him back to Ireland, and then off he goes back to the US. So, what's important for us to know about Kincora is that this abuse was very well reported on. It was known about. Most people in the North would have already known about Kincora.
Mm.
And this was, again, part of a huge cover-up operation, even when there was three staff of Kincora even prosecuted for this. Now, this prosecution was a way to deflect away from the complicity of British intelligence, the British government, and of the system itself, and to try and pin the blame on a few staff
A
members.
few bad apples, and we see that theme across this whole system. It's like people are thrown to the wolves, so the
Yeah.
system is protected all of the time. And having three people prosecuted like that covers up the wider corruption and rot, which is the system itself. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly. And these people, so one of them in particular is quite revealing, but he's not unique, is a man called William McGrath. And William McGrath, so he was essentially a confirmed MI5, MI6 agent who wasn't ever really prosecuted or punished because he was an intelligence asset. He was also a leader within a unionist paramilitary group called Tara Group. And
hmm
they had close connections with Ian Paisley, with Maggie Thatcher, and with, as I said, this ideology of British Israelism, which
yeah.
goes on to be quite important in something called Labour Together later down the line,
We'll
which
remember
we
that.
could go
So
into at a
British
later point.
Israelism and yeah, Labour together. Okay.
Yeah, so McGrath also was responsible for taking kids out of Kincora. So Kincora was a feeder node into this system where
Hmm.
boys would be taken from Kincora and transported to other places. Now,
Yes.
this often was across the border, and who was also an important part of this network in Ireland is Lord Mountbatten, who was killed allegedly by the IRA in 1979.
Yeah.
So Lord Mountbatten, he had a house in Sligo called Classybon, and
Hmm.
this was a site where people such as McGrath, others as well, who were called Mains or McKeag, Cunningham, several different people that are mentioned throughout David Burke's analysis, bring children to Lord Mountbatten's castle, where he hosts again parties of different kinds, invites this sort of Anglo-Irish aristocracy who seem to also have a lot of involvement in this system.
And
And
yeah. No, sorry, I'm just saying all it's important that already this is being framed as British aristocracy at the head of this system and British intelligence at the head of this system in Ireland. And that's how we need to frame it. This is who's sitting at the top of the system. And Lord Mountbatten is a member of the royal family and connected to Prince Andrew. Yeah. So Cassie Bondara, sorry.
yeah, so exactly. So with this link then, so we see several different sites. So Mountbatten's seems to be a key one in Sligo.
Yeah.
We also see Birr Castle in County Offaly, owned by somebody called Lord Ross,
Hmm.
seemingly another node in this system in the south. And we see several sites also along the Donegal, Fermanagh border, as described within these. We're not sure exactly where, but there is somewhere called Blessingburn that's named in Donegal, somewhere called Glenveigh, and seemingly other sites that are scattered throughout the country as ways of trying to infiltrate and to control different people and therefore different organizations. So
Hmm.
in Cora, actually, interestingly enough, it was unionist gangs that seemed to be being blackmailed and controlled through this to carry out clandestine operations in the North, in Britain, as well as in the Republic.
Yeah, clandestine operations. So here you see this horrible system that is out of sight of the public being used to achieve political goals and political ends. This is the modus operandi. Yeah.
Exactly. And remembering again that the sort of purpose of this strategy is to preserve conditions for extraction,
Exactly.
to essentially maintain a system of hierarchy. And
Hmm.
as you mentioned earlier, this sort of neoliberal strategy is sort of a good way to frame that, where it's about preventing people power and keeping in place this sort of triple strategy of neoliberalism, which is essentially about privatization, globalization, and deregulation, so that you have the invisible hand of the corporation able to, put its greasy hands in the till and take what they want from
Yeah.
where they want. Yeah?
And invisible being the key word. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
within this, then, so we see now Mountbatten, we see this name coming up a lot in the latest Epstein files. And why? Because his cousin, Prince Andrew Mountbatten, is all over these files. There's images that have come out of Prince Andrew, lying above the body of a young girl, and a lot of insinuations and evidence as to his potential complicity in not only pedophilia, rape, human trafficking, but also murder and potential, hiding of bodies, burying bodies, this sort of thing, all being explicitly linked to the Mountbatten family as a whole, aka the royal family.
Hmm.
So, when we look at this then and we start trying to understand this system, so the British government, up to the very top, in collaboration with unionist gangs, very closely linked with people like Ian Paisley, were running these operations as a way to maintain control on the island of Ireland.
Hmm.
And you have agents that were working throughout the South. The best known one is a man called Wyman, Wyman. He was actually arrested at points. He's linked to the Dublin bombings and with infiltrating on Garda Síochána and many more. So we know that these operations and these networks were active in the South across the island as a whole. And then we started to look into some other links as to how this network might actually operate in the South. And given what we know from Whitney Webb's research, from David Burke's research as to how high this goes in terms of the power structures, we then started to look for links in Ireland over the last sort of 70 years or so.
Yes.
So we
Hmm.
already saw that Roy Cohn had an explicit connection with
The
Kincora
North and British Israelism. Yep.
and British Israelism. Yeah.
Hmm.
What do we also see then? So J Edgar Hoover, who again was at the center of this network in the States, he is seemingly in close enough contact with a man called Archbishop John McQuaid.
Yes.
And this person, Archbishop John McQuaid, he's very famous. I mean, to my parents' generation and
Generation.
above,
Yeah.
he is like,
He's a pivotal character in Irish society, isn't he?
yeah,
You couldn't
yeah, yeah,
understate how much influence this man had. Yeah.
exactly. And there's books about him by John Cooney that explains the power he had really over Ireland. He co-wrote the Constitution
He
with De
co-wrote the
Valera.
Constitution with Eamon de Valera. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop of Ireland. Okay. And he and de Valera kept really close contact with him, as did Charlie Haughey. He really, really they kept his counsel. Um,
Yeah.
and he was famous for recording and keeping meticulous records of every interaction he had with politicians or any kind of person of note that came through his doors, to the extent that Hoover commended his system of surveillance. So this is a holy man, a holy man who is operating as though he fancies himself as a spy.
Mm. Yeah.
It's certainly, if you were a spy, that's probably how you'd operate. You'd develop lots of archives that the head of one of the biggest intelligence unit in the world would actually, praise. That's an interesting part about him. But yeah, so Quaid.
Yeah, so with McQuaid, he was in fact with his surveillance, I was even looking there's archives of his that exist online. And you can actually see even the folders and what he was actually gathering information on. And one of the biggest files, if not the biggest, but it's close to it, is a file on communism in Ireland. And he has like folders on like Pater O'Donnell and a lot of these socialist Republican characters in history.
Didn't he?
Yeah, it's online. You can actually see them and see what he was actually doing in this intelligence gathering. And that was something him and J. Edgar Hoover sort of bonded on, was not only surveillance, but also this militant anti-communism.
Militant
Um,
being the word there, because he also sent funds to Italy, didn't he? To be used, and this is a quote, to be used against communists. So what is that? He's funding, is it violence against communists? Is it
Well, you forget
propaganda?
also, I mean, like, the famous Wolf Tone song, Viva la Quinta Brigada, and they
Yeah.
mentioned specifically, the role of the church in encouraging Irish people in collaboration with the Blue Shirts, who became Fine Gael,
Yeah.
to go and fight on
Fascists.
behalf of Hitler and Franco.
Whew.
People forget this part of
We
Ireland.
can't forget these roots. We cannot forget these
But this
roots.
was done through the church, which McQuaid was at the center of at this period, you know?
Yes.
So McQuaid was another sort of foot soldier of the Cold War on the side of really the ruling elite.
Hmm.
And when we look at McQuaid's and his influence, so he also has a full chapter designated to him in the Black Market Babies book I referenced earlier by Mike Millett. So
Yeah.
when we see McQuaid and we see these sort of links again with the sort of Cold War nature, the surveillance, and then just the general power, and also Ireland's role in the Cold War, which we often think again we were somewhat insulated from, but actually we're on Britain's doorstep, and they were incredibly scared of the Irish liberation struggle. And this
Hmm.
goes back even before the Cold War began. Even if we look at the Proclamation of Independence 1916, if we look at the first Dáil and the Democratic Mandate, these are quite socialist outlooks on what the island of Ireland should look like. The last time we had a united Ireland, a democratically elected government in the Dáil, what did our democratically elected candidates actually say is that they
Hmm.
wanted to subvert private property to the common good of the people, that the Irish people had a right to the land, to the productivity, to the soil of Ireland, that Irish men and women, regardless of religion, were equal and deserved equal rights and opportunities, you know?
Yes. And this
So
was the
all of
key.
this is very scary to the British. Mhm.
Yes. And this was the key motivator of the War of Independence. It was these ideals, it was these goals. It came from the land war. It came from the horrible exploitation of like a peasant class. Like they were so impoverished by colonialism. They're on the back of the famine. Um, and the land war. And so this system that they're fighting for, it isn't just the flag, and it isn't just for the privilege of hoisting a flag over Leinster House. That famous James Connolly quote about how if you don't get rid of the capitalists, you'll basically be in the same position. You know it. I'm sure you know it off by heart, Tara, the one I'm talking about, and people listening.
Yeah,
You can hoist the flag over Dublin Castle, but if unless you get rid of the British capitalists, you're still oppressed.
yeah,
And we need to reckon with that now. And I think that that's the wider consciousness that is rising in our country now. And I think it shouldn't have taken Palestine to be that spark, but it has, because we realize, hang on, we actually don't have the agency or the wherewithal to impose sanctions. We
mhm,
don't have a say in our place in this system. Jesus, we really are subservient to it, and the people are at the bottom of that chain. And this
yeah,
goes back to how the government itself was established and who had a hand in it versus the people whose ideals were based on a system of equality and co-ownership of the land and resources. And that got, what's the word? That got hijacked, didn't it?
yeah, exactly. And like even when you read James Connolly, like even as far back as the 19th century, you know, he's talking about the unholy trinity in Ireland of landlords, capitalists, and then of usury, essentially banks, you know, and
Yes, yes.
what's
Mm.
changed, you know?
What
So
has changed?
when it comes to this, then, so the role of the church has typically been very reactionary in Ireland in terms of allying itself with power and preventing uh, real sorts of redistribution where it's been able to, both in Ireland but also internationally. So that's important for us to remember about Archbishop McQuaid.
McQuaid. Hmm.
And he was really at the head of the church, arguably the country, throughout the mother and baby homes scandal.
Yes.
And the mother and baby homes, again, once you can reapply this learning about how these systems operate and what was actually happening in Ireland at the time through British intelligence and this Anglo-Irish aristocracy, it certainly makes you think twice about the very suspicious activity that was being run out of the mother and baby homes in particular to start with, and
Yes.
a system of human trafficking. Yeah.
Yes. And that's what we need to name it. It was a system of human trafficking. People were making money and children were being taken from their mothers, from their sleeping arms during the night.
Yeah, yeah. So when we look back on the records from the mother and baby homes, so these a lot of these are published online, and there was a huge amount of controversy around the release of the mother and baby reports. The government only in 2020, I believe, voted to seal off these documents for another 30 years. And the cover-ups from the media to the government are really hard to believe and really echo a lot of the same cover-ups that happened in the United States and
Mhm.
in Britain.
We have our release, the Irish Files version of Release the Epstein Files campaign here in Ireland that we need to be
Honestly,
petitioning
yeah,
for.
and like
Yeah.
this was a huge story in Ireland 5, 6 years ago. There was a huge amount of outrage, a huge amount of confusion, anger from the victims who gave all of this testimony and evidence, and yet felt there was zero accountability.
Mhm.
So all of these crimes seemingly are all committed without any perpetrators. And it's the same with the Epstein files. They've just released
Yeah.
millions, zero arrests. Okay?
Mhm.
Zero
Mhm.
accountability. Why? Because it's being run by the institutions that are trying to then hold themselves to account.
Same
And
team,
of
same
course, you
theme.
have a contradiction there, right?
Yes. So who's being
So,
protected? Who is being protected by
exactly.
these
So,
records being sealed? And what is being protected?
exactly, exactly. And they know that if really people get to an understanding of the level of criminality and depravity behind this system, the whole thing would fall, you know?
Mhm.
So that's why they're being quite careful in what they release and how they release it, whose names they're redacting, what's being mentioned to throw people off the scent, and what is being left out to keep this state of confusion alive. Yeah?
Yeah.
So when we look at the mother and baby homes files, so if you go back even to 1950, there's a quote and it says, a December 1950 memo records Ireland had become a happy hunting ground for some US personnel seeking children to adopt and notes awareness of shady US intermediaries. Another quote, Ireland had quite the reputation amongst US Air Force personnel as a place to get children for adoption without much difficulty. Okay?
Without much difficulty, yeah.
So, who's in charge of the mother and baby homes? Archbishop John McQuaid, who has direct links to J Edgar Hoover, who's at the center of this ring across the Atlantic. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, what do we then also see? So, John Cooney, who wrote this book about McQuaid, also includes significant allegations of McQuaid himself being a pedophile. And even if we aren't to believe these allegations, he, at the very least, was completely aware of this abusive system that was responsible for the trafficking of a huge amount of babies. We don't know how many, but it's in the thousands at least.
We
The insane infant mortality ratio, where you have in this system known close to 60,000 babies and uh, 9,000 confirmed dead. So, about 15% of children that passed through these mother and baby homes died. In very suspicious circumstances, a lot of the time. We had the huge scandal of the Tuam babies being discovered,
Yeah.
800
By a
babies.
historian, by a curious amateur historian. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Who and this only I think I saw during the week there was bodies found at Tuam. You know, like this is not in anything like distant history.
No.
And we see then the level. So even a lot of Haughey's closest associates were found and were accused of rape, of pedophilia, of having babies with mystery women outside of their marriage. And you see the integration of church and state and the efforts that went into the cover-ups, because when you also look back on these times, there was a latent awareness that people had of what was actually going on in these mother and baby homes, but it was sort of just too much of a taboo to even
Yeah.
talk about. And the level of intelligence and control that the church had on the population meant that they had a very high degree of control over the narrative, what was reported, who was
Mhm.
blamed for things, and the ability to silence people who might have spoken up. Yeah.
And also there was, I read in this book, describing it as Ireland as a happy hunting ground, that people in Ireland also thought, because of the conditioning, because of the environment of fear, because of the strict Catholicism, which really dominated Irish life at that time, and even the use of the word illegitimate, as though you could ever put that
Mhm.
label on a human being, the whole thing is disgusting. But there was a
Yeah.
belief amongst the Irish population that these babies were being done a favor by being adopted to the US, where they would have a better life. And what wasn't known was that in a lot of cases, absolutely no background research was done into who was taking these babies. And worse, many of them had been rejected for their adoption applications in the US. These were not just the cream of the crop from the USA coming to give these children a better life. And the belief in Irish society, which was absolutely peddled by the likes of, the church, was that these babies were going on to better things, that this
Yeah.
was all for everyone's good. It was all for everyone's good.
Yeah. And with this, um, it also highlights the sort of hierarchical structure of Irish society in this period. In particular, this patriarchal nature of the society, due to the influence really of the church, but not only in terms of institutionally, we can point at the church, we can point at the government, but also we have to acknowledge the patriarchal society and the um, case often in terms of once a woman would get pregnant, that the man wouldn't want to acknowledge
Yeah.
that he had been responsible somewhat for the pregnancy and would not take any responsibility for this either. And we also see in this case some telling information, and particularly from Haughey.
Yes.
Where Haughey in the 60s, he said in reference to a quite infamous home called Rita's. So St. Rita's was basically a place where 8 children were picked out of St. Rita's and just given to the wives of US Air Force personnel. And Haughey joked about St. Rita's, saying half the children born in St. Rita's had been
Mhm.
fathered by TDs.
There you go. That's a huge insight into his character for me, that you could that he found that laughable.
Yeah.
And that will kind of give people an insight into the comfort level he had, not just at the existence of this system, of hiding uh the transgressions of these like pillars of society men,
Mhm.
that he laughed at it. He laughed.
Yeah, and Haughey also in this same period, again, before he ever became the Taoiseach, was he even was speaking about this scandal of babies being trafficked essentially to the United States without any proper oversight. As you mentioned, the checks done on these people in terms of their background, the primary one was just to see if they were Catholic or not. You know,
Yes.
this was
Mhm.
pretty much it.
Mhm.
And you have Haughey saying then, even in the Dáil on record, saying the adoption board have no function in regard to a child taken out for adoption in America. Basically saying once the baby is gone out of Ireland, not our responsibility anymore. And by the way, the government was also issuing passports for these babies. And there's huge discrepancies between the number of babies that were supposedly uh, sent to the States or that were taken from their mothers and being reported on even in the Irish Times. You have in some cases the number being reported over 500 in a specific year with only about 120 passports. And you were also seeing quite sophisticated methods of trafficking these babies outside of Ireland. And
Yeah,
what would happen is rather than the babies even being aborted, or sorry, rather than the babies even being adopted, what was happening was that the people adopting the child would actually just have the baby registered as born to them. And you see
that's right.
this as written
Mm.
testimony from US Air Force personnel that the baby was actually just registered as being
So
born
the
to
mother is erased, the birth parents are entirely erased.
yeah, and there was
Mhm.
even a woman I remember on the Late Late Show even talking about this happening to her. It's completely illegal to do this, by the
Of
way. It's
course.
illegal trafficking. It's illegal
And
fake
there's a money exchange
documentation.
happening here too in this illegal system. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's thousands of dollars being paid. The question is to who?
Hmm.
Um, and it's being paid to the institutions being run by the church and that are illegally trafficking babies out of Ireland. So the majority of these would go to the United States.
Yeah.
And so we then see this link. Okay, so we have Haughey, who is an increasingly important person in this story, particularly in the Irish context. So once you see him being linked with a few things, like, okay, Haughey was incredibly rich, incredibly corrupt. He was involved in major scandals, one of which in the 90s of phone tapping police
Journalists.
is one, or
Yeah.
journalist, was it?
Yeah.
He had also known like second wife, or at least having this a very public affair with the woman who would even write articles about this under an alias. It was another
It's
open
all very
secret.
exciting for them. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was another open secret, just like the mother and baby homes, that was never addressed directly by like the media and was kind of just accepted and not challenged, you know?
Hmm.
But when you look into Haughey a little bit more, so what else do you see that he had this private island off the coast of Kerry? He has all of these secret payments from incredibly rich men for political favors. And the one of these that stood out most was links he has to these Saudi billionaires.
Yeah.
And this was another thing that shows, okay, regardless, let's say with Haughey that he might not have really known who these people were, he might not have had any knowledge of their involvement within this wider Epstein network, but he was corrupted, right?
Yeah.
And how he was corrupted primarily through money, yes, but what do we know about these intelligence agencies and this network in particular is that they have multiple strategies for controlling powerful people.
Yeah. So, like you say here, he's corrupted, but he's also corruptible
Yeah,
because there is a kind of uh, a kind of a condition of entry into these systems. And as we see in the US and the wider circles, you must be corruptible
yeah,
and you
yeah,
must show potential for that to be invited deep into this network.
exactly. Exactly. So with Haughey, so there was a very famous scandal um, that I talked about in the first episode about Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
So Iran-Contra, it seems to be a scandal that the Epstein network were completely behind. And it's, when you look into it, a very good way of revealing who is in this network. So in Epstein's network, one of the original people who had Epstein on his payroll was this weapons smuggler called Khashoggi. I mentioned him in the first episode, and
He's
he
really
at times
important.
was one of the richest people in the world, this Saudi billionaire. His uh, main part in this network seems to be of weapons trafficking. And it also shows that this network as a whole, so what was their speciality in many ways was essentially moving people, moving weapons, moving money around the world, as well as being able to manipulate markets that they have made financial bets on.
Yes.
And with Khashoggi, he has very close links to this bank called the BCCI. And this bank was essentially being used to carry out a lot of the illegal activity that this network was responsible
This
for.
was the mass laundering bank, and people refer to it, its critics, as the Bank of Criminal and Crooks International. And
Yeah.
it's associated with the likes of the drug cartels, the
Mm.
Medellin. So people who were making money, big money in this underworld, as I'm going to call it, were using this bank, the Bank of Crooks Criminals International, BCCI. That's obviously not what it stands for, but that's a good way to remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so with this, so with Iran Contra, so just as you mentioned, so for example, even the cartels in Medellin in Colombia, and you have basically this scandal of weapons smuggling from Israel to Iran. You then have hostages being released. You then have weapons being sent as part of the Cold War against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And then what do you also have? Drugs being smuggled by the CIA from Colombia to the United States. These drugs were then being used to prosecute primarily black communities in the United States, put them into prison, where they end up as essentially slave labor for US corporations, who are one of the biggest benefactors of prison slave labor, Victoria's Secret, owned by
Wexner.
Wexner. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's just another strand of this. But back to this bank that
Yeah.
Epstein, he's named, and Whitney Webb does a lot of great research on this bank, on the Iran-Contra scandal, and the sort of shared interest that this network have in this structure.
Yeah.
And you see this being referred to, as a Ponzi scheme, as a front for organized crime to be able to transfer money around the world. So
Hmm.
there's a couple of people that are very central to this structure. One of them is called Mahfouz, is his name,
Hmm.
a Saudi billionaire. He has, I think, up to a 20% stake within this.
In this bank. Yeah.
And you have a couple of other people that are involved in this scandal as well. And one of them, even reported in the Irish Independent, is Osama bin Laden's brother. Um,
Sorry. Osama bin
yeah,
Laden's brother-in-law, brother.
brother-in-law, sorry. So there's an Irish Independent article about this in 2001.
Oh,
Haughey
we're getting
touched.
very close here now to the yeah, okay. So Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law is running this Bank of Crooks and Criminals International that Epstein is
Yeah.
linked to. Right. It's getting very close now. Okay.
Yeah, so in 1990, Haughey has a lunch with these Saudi billionaires. So Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, who
Hmm.
basically purchased Irish passports from Haughey in a sort of behind closed door deal.
And
So
this sheik,
mhm.
okay. He's buying passports, Irish passports. Okay.
Yeah, Irish passports. We don't know why, but he is, multi-billionaire. This guy Mahfouz, and this bank served the Saudi royal family, it served the Epstein network, and basically, you also see as part of the Cold War, say even with Al Qaeda, you also see the links between the Epstein network and 9/11. We referenced this photo that was found in Epstein's home of George Bush with the paper plane and the
Artwork.
Jenga
Someone
towers.
went to a lot of trouble to paint that.
Exactly. And you see this Operation Clean Break written by US Israeli intelligence asset Richard Pearl in the
Or,
90s that
mhm.
essentially paved the way for the invasion of Iraq.
Yes.
So you see then that there's very strong links between, Al Qaeda, between Bin Laden and this network, and they were funding him throughout the 80s too, remember, as part of the Cold War against the Soviets. And when we look at this connection here between Haughey and this network, this is a very explicit link where he met these people who were running the BCCI bank,
You'd have to know
directly
someone
complicit.
pretty well to invite them to the Shelburne Hotel to hand deliver them some passports, wouldn't you? You'd
Yeah.
imagine you'd have to have some kind of a decent rapport built up there.
Yes, you would think so. And there hasn't been a huge amount of study done on how this came about. Haughey claimed he couldn't remember how it happened.
Oh, he forgot. That
Yeah.
happens to Bertie Ahern as well. I think it's something to do with politicians and memory. I think maybe because there's so much information to remember, their jobs are so tough, they meet so many people. Like, I mean, I would forget if I met a Saudi billionaire in the Shelburne and I had forged passports, or not forged, I had just, sorted it out with the passport. Like that's very like who'd remember that?
Yeah, yeah, and this sort of passports aspect too, it comes up a lot in that, you see basically, for example, Epstein having an Austrian passport that was seemingly
Yeah.
secured by for him by the US ambassador to Austria. You had this scandal also about Israelis that committed a terrorist attack and they were found with Irish passports only maybe 15 years ago. And
Never
you
saw
see,
it. Yeah, okay.
yeah, and you see here then this exchanging of passports from Haughey with the Irish government to these Saudi criminals.
Hmm.
And we see then here another sort of interesting link in that this deal, supposedly there was 20 million agreed upon that would be exchanged. Um,
Invested in return for these passports in Ireland.
yeah,
Okay.
yes, we can only trace about 3 million, which
Oh,
was actually traceable. And all of this went to somebody called Noel C. Duggan in County Cork, in
okay. No
Macroom
Duggan.
in County Cork.
And who's no
And
Duggan?
yeah, and this was a bit of a wormhole now because Noel Duggan. So what happens was this money was sent to him. He had an equestrian center in Cork, and it was quite unclear as to why he received this money. Essentially, this money, the story goes that it went through the IDA, who are a very controversial institution in their own right in
Hmm.
terms of their sort of deep links to US foreign investment in particular. But with this money, it went through the IDA, ends up going to Noel Duggan in Macroom, and he then ends up hosting the Eurovision in Macroom in 1993 in a town of 1,500 people.
Very strange location, and that was built with the money from the investment from this sheik.
Yeah. So basically, this money went to this man. And anyway, even besides the sort of suspiciousness of that, so what did they have to do because the Eurovision was there is basically develop this place, which, for example, didn't have great infrastructure in terms of transport, in terms of electricity, and other things. So, what was also happening under the Haughey government was a lot of dodgy deals done where close associates of the Haughey government would buy very cheap land,
Yep.
and then this land would receive some sort of investment into the area that immediately dramatically inflates the value of the land itself.
Yep.
So that's one potential aspect of this. But what is strange is that this Duggan family, through Noel Duggan, now are very significant profiteers from the direct provision system in Ireland.
Hmm.
Which to me also is suspicious.
So
Um,
just about that and that link. So the centre that was used for the Eurovision is now being used to house refugees. Am I right in saying that? And there is another location. He's got multiple locations in Macroom that are used and has received millions from the taxpayer for that. Yeah.
yeah, millions as in like perhaps like 60 million plus, like a huge amount of money. Let's just see here. I think I have it. So
Okay.
77 million euro received by one report in the Irish Examiner.
Okay.
Uh,
And
mhm.
yeah, just before you go on, I just want to make it clear the taxpayers' place in this, our place in this whole system and how it happened. So here you have someone who's given this money by this billionaire sheik in these dodgy circumstances. And then just like what you said, Dara, like there were in Charlie's tenure, and this is well reported on, these rich developers, investors would buy up this land that wasn't zoned and had no services, and taxpayer money would be used to then, you know, supply electricity to this piece of land, sewage systems, water, everything connected. And then overnight, this land is worth 4 or 5 times the amount the investor bought it for, like in the space of a few months. So you can see, to me, that's a system of robbery from the taxpayer. The taxpayer then doesn't have any rights or any kind of doesn't get any value out of its contribution to this. The sole benefit of this, the person who gets all the benefit of this is the investor who did so little. And then you see a similar situation happen from the investment that Duggan is getting here in Macroom, where he's getting this investment through those dodgy dealings, and then the taxpayer is funding infrastructure development around the town.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
when you look at sort of this structure, it's very common around the world
Yeah.
and of basically this sort of siphoning of wealth up towards the very top.
Mhm.
Where you have sort of socialism for the richest people and you
Yeah.
neoliberalism for the poorest.
Yeah.
And basically, with this side in Macroom, just to have that data right, so the number of 65 million is only between the
Mhm.
years 2000 and 2015 to the Duggan family for direct provision.
Wow.
Yeah. And direct provision, again, remembering the root of this network, one of its key components is human trafficking, right? And you have a lot of suspicious activity that happens in the direct provision system. There's
Mm.
been a lot of controversy over direct provision centres in Ireland,
Yeah.
and especially the sort of IPAs and the lack of transparency over the direct provision centres, the lack of rights of people within these direct provision centres. And it's become a controversial subject because there's very valid criticisms of direct provision. There's very valid criticisms from communities who want greater transparency over this direct provision system, and in particular,
Mhm.
putting direct provision centers into the center of communities without any dialogue with communities. And this has been something that's been very much capitalized on by the far right in.
Yes, this is a huge issue in Ireland at the moment. It is, yeah, a point of massive Uh, division, polarization,
Yeah,
taboo. Suddenly political conversation becomes taboo and people are, yeah, it's something that really needs to be addressed because this system of direct provision, in truth, everyone deserves better than direct provision.
mhm,
Everyone. The
yeah,
people who are coming to Ireland, um, having fled horrific conditions,
yeah,
are being brought into this inhumane system where they're so unprotected and open to predators and system like exploitation through trafficking.
yeah,
And obviously the communities are going to, yeah, as well have some valid concerns that people reflexively say are motivated by racism, which isn't always the case. And we need to just kind of, yeah, we need to look at these things in Ireland because we'll get to it shortly if we've time, but like what Bannon is doing in Ireland.
yeah,
And we have a visitor this week in Ireland, Charlie Kirk's um, wife, who seems
yeah,
to have skipped the grieving process
yeah,
and is instead launched herself into converting everyone to her right-wing conservatism. And it's kind of like it's a really important time for Ireland. It's a really important time for us to reflect on what and who we are
yeah. And
and
it's
what
never
we've
been a
come
better
from.
time
It's never
to
been a better time.
also unite against a very small enemy in terms of how many of them
Small
there are
enemy.
relative to us, but
Yes.
an incredibly powerful enemy. And what do we also know that throughout this time, they're just trying to divide people. And this is something that
Yeah.
came out in the latest release of the Epstein files, is how much of this division is created by these people. So,
Yeah.
one of the very illuminating documents to be released was communications between Epstein and the founder of 4chan. And in the same 24 hours,
Yes.
4chan, by the way, is this sort of cesspit of reactionary online
Is it
debate.
associated with QAnon?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of the sort of far right influencers, such as like Nick Fuentes and a lot of these people in the
Mm.
States, would have come from QAnon, let's say.
Hmm.
And basically, in the same 24 hours as the founder meets with Epstein, he sets up the politics section of the website. And what do you also see in separate communications?
Meets with Epstein or Bannon?
So this is, I believe, Epstein.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And you then see in separate communications that Ghislaine Maxwell is moderating and has set up the equivalent across Reddit forums.
Across Reddit forums and people, my sister included, a lot of people go to Reddit because they think that's where they're going to get the genuine information,
Mm,
the
mm, mm,
real,
mm.
like the unsayable things that you can't say in maybe the public domain. So people are that bit more honest and the information is more authentic.
Yeah,
And that is Reddit's place. So you have people like that who fully recognize what these forums are. And they
yeah,
are like, this is how organized they are. And this is what people really need to kind of grasp the lengths they go to in terms of. So she's inside in Reddit forums.
yeah. And so just that reminds me, so like again, with we mentioned Chomsky.
Chomsky.
Um,
Mm.
so with Chomsky being so closely related to this network and seemingly being a very close friend of Epstein, it sort of shows as well he had a bit of an insight into how this whole operation works, and it's likely why his analysis was often very useful, even though it was
His,
deliberate, controlled opposition. But
it
parts
was
of his analysis are still useful. Mhm.
Yeah, because his insight is born from his visibility of the system that nobody else has, and people think this genius, this like this like philosopher king, as Norman Finkelstein called him. And it
Mhm.
turns out all that intellectual clarity isn't born of some kind of innate gift from God. He's got proximity to the system. He's a very, very close relationship with Epstein maintained over years and
Exactly.
continued after Epstein's arrest to the extent that he fell out with his own children because of
Yeah.
his insistence on keeping that connection with him.
Yeah, and that's
And
another very important thing to remember is Epstein was actually arrested for this in 2008, you know? So there's all these
yeah,
people who kept very close connections and friendships with him, continued to visit his islands, continued to rely on him for advice related to financials or whatever else was helping the illegal aspects of their corporations. But Chomsky, he says there's a great quote from him, and it basically says the business classes are very class conscious. They're
yes.
constantly fighting a bitter class war to improve their power and diminish opposition. So this is really the reality of this system again. It's class war, and it's not just a case necessarily of, okay, the capitalist class and the working class, which make up this dialectic, but it's actually a very powerful and sophisticated hyper core that are globalized, extremely well organized, but also bound together in a class unity that's based on pedophilia and child trafficking and other crimes that they are able to have this sort of collective dirt on each other to be able to work together despite
Mhm.
being evil, narcissistic, self-centered parasites, really.
Mhm.
And
I think they're better. And it's important to realize it isn't just that they think they're great and superior. They actually loathe the poor. They have a real kind of disgust and hatred for them that needs to be appreciated because we could not figure out how on earth everyone wasn't responding to the massacre we were seeing on our screens of babies and children and human beings and mothers and fathers and grandparents in Gaza. We
yeah,
couldn't understand that. And
yeah,
now we can. That's what I'm hearing people say. They can because they can see how much hatred these people have for people they think are nothing. The poor, like you have Epstein quoted as saying, like, how do we get rid of the poor? And we
and
need
who
to
was he
know that.
talking to? Bill Gates. That
You know
quote
what I
is in
mean? And Bill
reference to
Gates
Bill Gates.
poses as this philanthropist that is saving the world. And then here we find out he secretly drugged his wife with antibiotics to avoid her knowing that he passed on as an STD to her.
Yeah, that he
And
likely got from a
he's
child
our
prostitute.
like,
Yeah,
so we really need to kind of consolidate our awareness, and we need to
yeah,
know that we're being deliberately divided, the working class, the top and the bottom. Forget left and right. Forget like in
yeah.
Ireland it was Protestant and Catholic. Um, it's top and bottom.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be some reconciliation between the people too, in a way, because, you know, these Epstein files and these what were called conspiracy theories, and I think the word conspiracy needs to just be sort of composted at this stage. But
Yeah,
the people that were actually the canaries in the coal mine about a lot of this stuff were the people that were being labeled as conspiracy theorists and far right or far left, and
that's right.
uh, the sort of mass population, seemingly without noticing, identified more with this class of parasites than they did
Imagine the
with
very people
the
who hate
poor
them.
of their own
Mm.
populations. And
Yeah,
I think there needs to be a reconciliation between the people who were raising the alarm about these networks, and not only these networks, but also about the activity of these networks and the future that they're creating for us, and find where we can unite on. Maybe we can revisit that at a later point if we get time in this podcast, because I think it's a different discussion, or who knows, maybe a part
I
three.
think I think that it will arise at the after this conversation. Once
Yeah,
we figure out how this system is operating, we will look at what the alternative is, and
yeah,
that can be a separate conversation because we're really tricked into believing that at the center of the left and right working class people are these level-headed centrist politicians who can mediate the interest between, and there isn't. You've got parasites at the center of left and right wing working class people who are
yeah,
absolutely manipulating, and it is their full-time job to stoke and divide the power and split the power of the working class. And we can see that. We can see that this how the system emerged in its anti-communist um, kind of out like mission. And it has the
yeah,
same mission today. And the mission today is to divide the left and right. So
yeah,
yeah, okay. We'll
yeah.
we'll
So
refocus in terms of this investment that came from this sheik who is operating from this criminal international bank.
yeah.
Um, okay.
So I just want people to remember this link, okay,
Yep.
between the direct provision centers in Macroom in Cork and the people receiving money directly from this Epstein network.
Yes.
Okay?
Hmm.
So let's just bring it back a little bit to Haughey, to McQuaid, to Ireland again, and then we're going to go forward and bring that link home again. So
Okay.
when we look at the Irish context and the links between British intelligence and also just to kind of several key people. So what do we see between Haughey and McQuaid? So they were corrupt. They both had their castles, their mansions. They both had their surveillance programs, and they were both connected to this network. McQuaid through J Edgar Hoover, Haughey through Mahmoud Fustok and Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, who were running the BICC and the Iran-Contra network. Okay,
Hmm.
so then when you start to look in further into the Irish context and you start to say, okay, so this in the Irish part of the system was being run by British intelligence and this Anglo-Irish aristocracy.
Yeah, they're
So
at the top of the system in Ireland. Okay. Yeah, with in
yeah,
cahoots with. Okay.
yeah, and they're collaborating quite closely with unionist paramilitary gangs and the upper echelons of British government from Thatcher to King Charles. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, who is another key part of this network, who again is directly connected to Mountbatten, who's directly connected to Haughey, is a man many people will know, Jimmy Savile. Okay?
Yeah.
So, Jimmy Savile was introduced to Haughey by a woman called Lady Golding. Lady Valerie Golding is her name.
Hmm.
And she is a member of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. She served in the British military alongside her husband in World War II. And her presence in Ireland to start with is through British military and intelligence. And she's very closely related, daughter of somebody very prominent in the British occupation of Ireland, and with very suspicious links in different ways that I think it's a bit of a wormhole in itself. But important thing to know is that she is a very wealthy British aristocrat in Ireland who
Hmm.
has links to British military and intelligence and made an introduction between Jimmy Savile and Haughey
Yeah, and just one
about
other thing about in
philanthropy.
terms,
Mhm.
she's associated also with her with a plot during World War II to capture Cove Harbour. Isn't this
So that is her through her father, not
through her
her
father?
directly,
Okay, so
but
she's not working in Ireland's interest. Just bear in mind that use that as an example of what this woman is doing in this country, and she's working in an intelligence capacity, and she makes the connection between Savile and Haughey, and she's also doing philanthropic work. Here's another theme
yeah.
in Ireland. Okay.
So that role of philanthropy throughout this network is another very important thread to keep in mind. So
Yeah.
if you remember back to the first episode and we talked about this mega group, or even, for
Yes.
example, Bill Gates, is that all of these criminals who were very prominent in the organized crime network are now all of the biggest philanthropists on earth.
Mm,
Okay,
mm.
and maybe we can come back to that at a later point to try and
Yeah.
understand the reasons why and the influence that that gives you, and the sort of deliberate uh,
Washing of your
skewing of kind of trying to prevent
image.
any systemic change from happening, so they get the power to control where money flows to or not. So it
Yeah.
gives them political power to be able to decide where this money goes to. So she introduces Haughey with Jimmy Savile. And
Yeah.
what people might not realize about Jimmy Savile is he was seemingly the right-hand man to both King Charles and Margaret Thatcher. You know?
Extraordinary. So we have this prolific paedophile and predator sitting in a really powerful position within the royal family
Yeah. And
and the prime minister.
basically,
Yeah.
so this woman, so she was in charge of the CRC, the Central Remedial Clinic, I believe, which is actually, I think, quite a reputable establishment that still exists today as a charity for people with disabilities, in particular children,
Right.
who Savile would have had direct access to. Now, there's no reports of any wrongdoing from Savile in Ireland. At the same time, there was such a culture of secrecy and cover-ups that you don't know what was
Yeah.
happening really. But you know he was in the English equivalents, taking very much advantage of his position in children's hospitals and others to abuse kids. We don't know that if that was happening in Ireland or not, but what
Mhm.
do we know? That he was referred to basically as King Charles, who was Prince Charles at this point. He had all of these different titles and roles, and supposedly spent 11 years in a row spending Christmas with Maggie Thatcher. Okay. And Maggie
Wow.
Thatcher was very much involved in Kincora and the British intelligence operations in Ireland at this time. So we see here another sort of direct link between Haughey and this network.
Yeah.
So with this link then, so Savile again seemed to have a similar role in some ways as Epstein might have, except he was more on the sort of socialite rather than Epstein was marketed more so as financial advisor. So with this link again we have with Savile, Haughey would meet with Savile quite often and end up sort of donating money to Lady Golding's charity in the CRC.
Okay.
So this is another link. Maybe it means
Mhm.
something, maybe not. You know, Savile was a
Mhm.
major
Mhm.
celebrity at this time. We don't know if there's any sort of wrongdoing here, but we do know that Savile was an intelligence asset for the British at the same time. And we
Yeah.
do know that the British had lots of tabs on Haughey. They seemingly believed he was, involved in Irish republicanism. There was a scandal of Haughey attempting to send weapons to the IRA in the north. Now, there's disputed information about that in
Mhm.
particular, but it is
Mhm.
an example potentially of Haughey doing some of the weapons trafficking that does occur within this network.
Mhm.
And he was responsible for a lot of shady activity, a lot of sort of brown envelopes, you could say. And there is then a significant scandal in Ireland in the 1990s, or in fact, sorry, first in the 1980s, and others in the 1990s, or in fact, at every point in Irish history, there are scandals, there are corruption. And I think we also need to remember that in the present. You know, it's very easy for us to look back on and say, oh, they
We're
were so,
great in hindsight.
yeah,
And
they
in
were
the
so
present day, we're
good.
like, no, that would never happen.
Yeah,
What are you
yeah.
talking about? Yeah,
Um,
no, we're very naive that way. Yeah.
so in the 80s, and I won't go into this too much detail now, but maybe
Yeah.
it's something that people might want to explore themselves, is a big scandal in the 80s revolving around Haughey's Attorney General. It was called this Boo
Mm-hmm.
Boo scandal at the time. And basically it involved Haughey's Attorney General, a guy called Connolly. It involved a seemingly wealthy man called MacArthur, who ends up in the castle of a retired US diplomat who just so happens to be a Jewish man from New York who served as a diplomat during the Cold War in England and now somehow has a castle in
Castle called Camelot
called
in
Camelot that he would have
geography.
big parties and invite lots of this sort of aristocracy to come to events. And what do we also know? That there was some sort of black book in terms of who had come to the parties, etc., that was then used for evidence as a later point to be able to identify this man, MacArthur, who went there with a gun. seemingly on behalf of Haughey's Attorney General Connolly. He was staying at one of his flats at the time. The lease was in Connolly's name, and he went straight from Camelot Castle to Connolly's home immediately after.
Mhm.
Then in the 90s, so you have another Haughey Attorney General installed by Haughey in 92, I believe, who is then still the Attorney General when there's a significant scandal involving somebody called Father Brendan Smith. And Father Brendan
Yeah.
Smith was essentially wanted by British intelligence in the north, I believe, or
Mhm.
British authorities, sorry. And
For
there
abuse.
were calls for his extradition from
Mhm.
Ireland to the north, and he was basically just in a monastery at this time and was being very deliberately protected by the Irish state. And this scandal actually led to the fall of the government
Yes,
due to the lack of transparency over
because
this whole scandal.
you had an extradition request that was going ignored by the Irish Attorney General, who was appointed by Haughey for this guy's extradition. And in the end, this Brendan Smith actually presented himself after months of this process because maybe he was being, I suppose, ostracized or whatever. He gave himself up. And the Irish government was like, oh, it was taking us longer than it should have because of legal complexity, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, yeah. And significantly, so this is the same guy, Harry Wheelahan, the Attorney General. So
Mm-hmm.
he was the Attorney General in the very famous X case,
Yes.
um, which was about this teenager who was raped.
14-year-old
And
girl.
she wanted to go to the UK for an abortion.
Yeah.
And essentially, he made the decision that this would be a criminal act. And this was a precursor, really, to the Eighth Amendment. So this was, sorry, a test case of the Eighth Amendment that was introduced in the 80s and was a very famous case in the repeal movement to try and re-legalize abortion, especially in these sort of cases.
And
So,
there was a coalition government, and the partner in government with Haughey at that time really didn't want the appointment of this Attorney General. Is that right?
yeah, so he was deeply unpopular already
Yeah.
because of this decision, and
Mm.
then was very controversially, despite I think more than 80% of the people opposing this
Appointment.
decision. And then when the extradition of Father Brendan Smith and the controversy surrounding it, again, this was for child sex abuse, and they were protecting him, very blatantly protecting him. This ended up taking down the Irish government, essentially. And it's not the first time a government has been taken down due to these sort of
Protection.
scandals. In England, there's a very famous case, again, better for people to look into this themselves, called the Profumo scandal in the
Mhm.
60s. And this
Mhm.
Profumo scandal was a similar sort of case. In this case, we have it being more explicitly linked to this network. Um, and it was used to take down the British government in the 60s. This had links to the KGB. And very significantly, too, it had links to a man called Sir Gilbert Laithwaite and another person called Galbraith. And Galbraith is also named by Robin Bryan as having connections to St. Rita's in Dublin.
Mm.
So we have these sort of connections, and we have a lot of very suspicious activity from the Irish government in
And
terms of
covering up
covering up
as a theme.
for
Covering
these
up
sex
as a
abuse
theme.
scandals. And when you try and make sense of them and you see what was happening in the US, what was happening in Britain, is that there was cover-ups happening because there was a lot we didn't know with regards to connections to people in positions in power, in terms
Mhm.
of material for blackmail and intelligence operations that nation states didn't want to be exposed.
Yes. Yes, and we have got to bring that to the present where we still have sealed records, and we've got to understand that there is like we can't ignore that there could, like I have to say that there could be malicious intent, but what really looks like that. Um, and I just think a really good insight into the attitude of the state in terms of their role in safeguarding children and the most vulnerable of society
Mm.
stands out to me. And it's taken from the book. I'm not sure, Dara, what the name of the book is. I might later put some links into some of the books we read, particularly
Mm.
on the mother and baby homes. But the Irish Times said almost 500 babies were flown from Shannon for adoption last year. And they said that in 1951. And an internal memo from the Department of External Affairs at that time said, it would be interesting to know how the Irish Times obtained that figure. That was
Mhm.
their concern. How did the Irish Times know? Not the scale of the
Yeah.
trafficking of children, but how did they know?
Yeah.
How do they know about our system?
Yeah. And so that's the book I read. So Banished Babies, it's called.
Banished
A kind of
babies.
Secret
Okay.
History of Ireland's Baby Export Business.
Okay.
And Mike Malott is the person I think referenced in that article.
Thank you.
And exactly, and that's what people have always struggled to make sense of is why, like why all this cover up, why all this mystery, why all of this lack of justice and accountability for all of these victims. And when you start to understand this global network as a whole, you can apply a new lens to this system as a whole, and especially
Hmm.
when you think of it in the Cold War context and you understand what these different intelligence agencies are actually doing, you
Hmm.
see, like sickeningly, that babies and children are actually a key input into the Cold War machine.
Yeah.
That's just an input of the system.
Yeah.
And I think we need to understand it in that way. And even in terms of the global economy as a whole, when you look at the size of the human trafficking industry, you see that this is actually a key part of the global economic system is human trafficking. And
Hmm.
almost half of that human trafficking is seemingly for sexual activity. Then a little bit more than half is for forced labor that
Hmm.
corporations are
Hmm.
exploiting for higher profits. So when we then look at this and we can start tracing up a little bit more towards the present. So again, trying to keep, say, this link with British intelligence, British government and decision makers, and today is the significant scandal coming out of England today is through this guy, Peter Mandelson.
Yes.
So Mandelson, by the way, was at a stage the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, I believe. And you see then with these links, they go back a long way, and you see a lot of influence at quite pivotal moments, even throughout history. One I think that deserves a mention, it's a bit of a just a quick side point, is George Mitchell, who has been
Hmm.
seen throughout these Epstein files, who was one of the key people in the Good Friday Agreement. He
Yes.
served on the 9/11 Commission
Yeah.
as well. And we see sort of very clear links between George Mitchell and this network, which also goes to show, given the level of collaboration between British and US and Israeli intelligence, that this agreement was never a fair playing field. The same thing,
Yeah.
we see direct connections with the Oslo Accords.
Hmm.
happening the same thing between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. Who's at the center of both? Bill Clinton, who seems to be one of Epstein's closest friends and has been very present throughout this network for
So
decades.
people at the heart of these peace agreements were those who were most oppressed under these systems would say they got a raw deal. Of course they did. Were conducted by people who were closely linked to Epstein and
Yeah.
George Mitchell in particular in terms of Ireland. And just to give people, just to go a small bit back to what you said about how bad we are in the present day to recognise the glaringly obvious. We saw an article, an absolute abomination in The Independent from Eilish Hanlon,
Mhm.
where she wrote the drivel
Yeah.
about how she was defending George Mitchell and saying that just because you're mentioned in the Epstein files, and she didn't even mention the victim whose testimony condemns him. We shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be doing it. And, everyone's gone hysterical, which is a theme in Irish media to
Yeah.
patronize people who dare to use their critical thinking faculties. It is a way to go wackos, hysterical mob. We see it with other Irish journalists as well
Mhm.
when they patronize people for objecting neutrality. But just to keep that in mind in the present day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And what she left out of this is just because George Mitchell is mentioned, what's he mentioned as doing? Raping Virginia Giuffre.
Yes. Yes.
Like
One of
just
the
like it's
key
not like he's just
weapons.
mentioned. And
He has
also,
that
again,
credibility. Yeah.
Epstein was arrested for child trafficking in 2008. George Mitchell said he didn't keep contact with him. Yes, very obviously did.
Yes.
So it's not like, he's just happens to be mentioned. No. Like he's mentioned as raping a victim of child trafficking who came forward and she's defending him. It's
Hmm.
really disgusting. And
And
you
that's our
see a lot of
media.
people also defending Mandelson at the same time. Um, so Mandelson is somebody that has really been at the heart of this operation. Epstein would have called him Petey, and
Right.
they were again
Edie.
best buds it seems. And Mandelson is very much at the center of this network in the English government. He has a very close links, for example, with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. They were seen as a trio, essentially.
Yeah.
And that also connects very directly with the Iraq invasion too, which Tony Blair was completely on board with. And then when we start to trace this into today, so we see Mandelson really at the heart of the Keir Starmer government. And Mandelson was advised by many uh, to be a very inappropriate selection to be this deeply ingrained into the British government because of his connections with Epstein. People knew about these. This isn't actually recent revelations, even though the recent releases do go deeper into what their relationship actually looked like. But this was already known. Okay.
Hmm.
So the Starmer government, there's a few people that seem to have a lot of power that work behind the scenes. And Mandelson is one of them. And Mandelson was part of this Labour Together movement, which was responsible for essentially ridding the Labour Party of its more leftist elements, in particular, getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn,
Corbyn.
a
And
conservative
associated
rhetoric.
earlier British Israelism, as you said earlier as well. And it's
Exactly. Very
okay. Yeah.
closely
And
linked to
getting
British
rid of
Israelism.
Corbyn is another one of its key motives. Okay, so Labour together.
Exactly. And this ties again into the sort of Cold War strategy in general. Okay.
Hmm.
And like what they've
Hmm.
very successfully done is taken over, like the conservatives work similarly, you could say, to the Republicans in the US,
Yeah.
and the Democrats are supposedly meant to be representing the working class,
Yeah.
such as Labour. And there's very deliberate attempts to take over the
Infiltrate.
opposition in both
Yeah.
of these cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to turn them into sort of right-wing Zionist organizations.
Yes, and that's a really important parallel, that if we see Labour as Democrats in the US, and
Yeah.
they're trying to do is kick out any any hint of a people's kind of people gaining power, such as kind of
Yeah.
the politics of, in the case of Labour, Jeremy Corbyn,
And
um,
they did something similar with Bernie Sanders in the US
and the
through the
Bernie Sanders
Clintons.
news. Now, people would say
Yeah.
that Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, they still represent the system. We need to go much further than that.
Mhm.
Um,
But they
and
at least they somewhat threatened the uh,
the status quo.
privilege of accumulation and extraction that these
And they
people.
could be the beginning of something. That's what they could
Yeah.
represent, the beginning of a slide in another direction.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when it comes to Mandelson then, so he was very involved in Labor Together. Labor Together is financed, a lot of it's financed through a man called Trevor Chin. And Trevor Chin is a huge philanthropist for Jewish and pro-Israel causes. Okay, so he has a lot of involvement in the relationship between Labor and Israel, and has also been a major financer of people like Tony Blair as well.
Mhm.
So he is a large part of the money behind this organization. Who else is very directly connected to Mandelson and this organization is this man we're hearing a lot of, Irishman called McSweeney,
He's
right?
very interesting character. More, is
Yeah.
it Morgan McSweeney?
Morgan McSweeney is his
Yeah,
name.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And there's a lot of articles, a lot of media around this man, Morgan McSweeney, because he seems to have a very outsized role in the Labour government in terms of Labour
Mm.
strategy and more. And he has been working since with Mandelson now for 25 years or so. They worked on a very sophisticated intelligence gathering. What to even call this? Is it a product or at least a project called
Hmm.
Excalibur? And
Hmm.
this was sort of designed in theory for strategy around how to win elections, how to gather information on people.
Hmm.
And what did have they also been responsible for in general is sort of like labor conservatism, as trying to
Yeah.
basically shift the dial in the
So
labor
not Labour.
towards neoliberalism as a whole.
Yeah.
And they have seemingly kept a very close relationship. And the more you look into this guy, Morgan McSweeney, the more suspicious things get, in that he
Yeah.
also spent time in a kibbutz in Israel in the
Hmm.
90s on, I
Hmm.
believe, illegally stolen Palestinian land. Well, I mean, all of it is at the end of the day.
Hmm.
And he was seemingly the person most responsible for getting Mandelson into Starmer's government, despite a lot of people advising against it due to the Epstein links. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah. He's really, really wielding a lot of power in the
Mhm.
shadows. This
Yeah,
person who is
yeah,
Irish and who spent time in Israel,
yeah,
and whose mission is to get Corbyn out and Mandelson
yeah.
in. Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so there's also, and maybe I'll just like not go into this too much now, but
But for
basically,
people,
if
if
you
they
look
want
into
to, yeah.
Morgan McSweeney,
Hmm.
basically, where he kind of first comes into the fray is supposedly through a man called Steve Reed, or EED, in Lambeth. And when you look into this too, there's also some kind of suspicious activity happening in Lambeth. There's a fight sort of within the Labour Party as to basically trying to change the sort of strategy of Labour here, which they had described as sort of radical left or Trotskyist or this sort of red
Red
scare.
Ted was the person they called him, was his nickname, who was in power before Peter
Yeah,
Mandelson, and
red Ted Knight. Yeah.
they wanted to get him out of there, and they wanted to just, I suppose, yeah, it was emerging as kind of, a place where that kind of political thought was gaining a bit of a foothold, and it needed to be extinguished. And then they associated that movement with all sorts of crime in the area, from really fringe characters,
Yeah.
They did their best. Okay, yeah.
And Lambeth is also at the center of another very significant sex scandal in British history.
Hmm.
I think there's maybe 700 plus allegations of sexual abuse across maybe three homes in Lambeth during this period. Again, it's a link we don't know exactly, but is just another potential link to this network, especially then when you know the significance of Mandelson and McSweeney in this network later down the line. It's just another one of those things that raises an alarm bell. But as I said,
Yeah.
it's speculation and maybe better to not go into too much today.
Hmm. Yeah.
So then you look into McSweeney again and just trying to bring it back home to our context. So,
Hmm.
what do we also see then is McSweeney under Starmer's government, which has become very hostile to migration, to refugees, this stop the boat narrative that's becoming very politically popular, largely being driven still by the same media that's owned by Murdoch or that was owned by Robert Maxwell, by the way.
Yeah.
And we see that despite this sort of just outright racist rhetoric, today you see in Ireland, Morgan McSweeney's family are running direct provision centres out of Macroom in Cork. So
Wow.
I
So
just
you're
wanted
bringing
to
us back now
remind
to
people.
Duggan, who also has a thriving family business in the direct provision industry.
Yeah.
And Morgan McSweeney's family, his cousin, his uncle, I think, isn't it? They also have a thriving family business in the direct provision industry. And but doesn't his own family in the UK where they're living also have one?
I'm not sure actually in the UK. I know, so
Okay.
in Cork, but maybe do you know of this?
I won't confirm it. I
Okay.
thought I had read that, but we can just do the Irish
Could be
connection
the
if you want.
case. But
Yeah.
Tim, there was some misreporting done on this in British tabloids that McSweeney's parents were running these centres in England. Maybe I saw that as well, actually.
Oh,
But
and that wasn't
like,
true.
yeah, from what I could tell in
Right.
my research, it's only in Ireland.
Only
Tim
in
and
Ireland.
Carmel McSweeney are their names, and
Yeah.
they're making millions from direct provision in the same place as the Duggan family are from. Um, Again, maybe them both being from the
Coincidental.
same town, like, it doesn't have to be anything that's like too suspicious. But what is suspicious is the fact that they are running direct provision centers, just like the Duggans who are running direct provision centers,
Hmm.
and they're both directly connected to this network. A huge part of this network is human trafficking.
Is human
Okay.
trafficking. Yeah.
And if you also look into Cork and Macroom, there's also been allegations of sex rings being run in this place. And you see in Ireland, increasingly so, even Gardaí reports of human trafficking occurring in Ireland.
In North Cork, especially,
Yeah,
yeah, there's been, yeah, lots of concerns raised by locals and there's been incidents. So yeah,
yeah,
that's something that people can look into.
exactly, exactly.
Hmm. Yeah.
And what else comes up with Morgan McSweeney is turns out his cousin, a woman called Claire Mungovan, is a Fine Gael advisor and has been an advisor and consultant to both Leo Varadkar and Simon Harris.
Wow. So the same family, you have Morgan McSweeney being, having that extreme proximity to power in the UK, and then you have his cousin having that proximity to power in Ireland. Wow.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
even if you look at sort of the politics, because even the McSweeney family, Tim and Carmel, they seem to be quite a strong Fine Gael family in general.
Hmm.
You can see lots of connections between this family and Fine Gael. And then if you look at the politics of Fine Gael and just compare it to the sort of desired outcomes in politics of this network, is first and foremost this what's best described as sort of neoliberalism, even though it's now being accelerated beyond even what neoliberalism was, and it's sort of towards now this kind of techno-fascism,
Yeah.
you could call it. But neoliberalism really at the heart of this, and remembering back to the links with Fine Gael, how did this party actually start, and what was it most closely connected to was this blue shirt movement, again, very closely linked to the Irish Catholic Church. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so when
Mm.
you then look again about the sort of functioning of the Irish government, and you also then at the same time look at what the Irish government is trying to push through. So, and this, by the way, it's not just Fine Gael, as we saw, for example, with Haughey, and also this Attorney General role of the of Fianna Fáil governments in particular
Yeah.
seems to also be very suspicious.
Hmm.
But what do you see in the link between Haughey and these Saudi billionaires was the IDA as a sort of mediator between this dark money and financial projects in Ireland. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
You also see very prominent billionaires behind the scenes in Ireland, including Ben Dunn and Dennis O'Brien. They come up a lot
Hmm.
in this research. Again, billionaires in general, they don't need to be running sophisticated human trafficking networks, or they don't need to be
Hmm.
involved in them necessarily to be a billionaire. But what do we know? It's part of the general billionaire strategy, and it's a key aspect of the globalized system. It doesn't mean that these people are involved in that sort of
No.
activity.
No.
But the IDA in particular are seemingly mediating between, say, the government and this money. And when we look at today and you see the files that are being released more and more, is what do we see as this sort of big tech oligarchy that's very much emerged in the last couple of decades in particular. And I think this very much links together a lot of the general surveillance. It's increasingly merging with the military industrial complex, as we
Mhm.
saw throughout the genocide, and as we looked at in Ireland's own complicity in the genocide, and a big explanatory factor in why the Irish government has still not implemented even the basics of the Occupied Territories
We
Bill,
don't have the
which they
power
got
to do
elected on.
that.
It explains Ireland's trade connections with Israel. Where has all of the scale up happened since the Occupied Territories Bill was signed? Through the tech companies.
Yeah.
And the IDA plays a very key role in mediating the demands of the tech industry and the activity of the Irish government in
And
terms of
we have.
projects, tax reliefs, infrastructure that's built, and the general
Mhm.
priorities of the Irish government as a whole, first and foremost, are really designed to serve this tech oligarchy. And we look at the likes of Gates and Microsoft, Zuckerberg, we look at the Google co-founders, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, all of these, you could even mention Pfizer,
Mhm.
all of
Mhm.
the top corporate taxpayers in the country. And when you look at the policy of the Irish government, it essentially reflects their demands. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And you see then, you mentioned this quote of Epstein and Bill Gates having a discussion. How do we get rid of poor people? Right?
Mm. Yeah. And
And
they don't mean to solve poverty. That's not what they meant. Yeah.
no, and then you also have basically quite a lot of information around them talking about pandemics as far back as 2015, I believe,
Hmm. Hmm.
And again, this was sort of seen as a sort of right-wing conspiracy in terms of people not wanting to get vaccinated, for example, not agreeing with the policies of the governments regarding lockdowns and surveillance and loss of our supposed rights. And this was another failure, I think, of the left in Ireland is that these people, I remember in 2020, I went 2021 maybe to Herbert Park where there was a protest against the restrictions against RTE's coverage and essentially demanding more clarity around the pandemic. And this was like sort of the beginning of the far right in Ireland in many ways. Why?
Hmm.
Because people who had questions about the system typically were people that were being ostracized in some way or exploited by the system, who had legitimate questions around the pandemic and other things, yet they were sort of mocked in a certain way, and they were criticized very heavily as not doing their part for society or whatever. And, there's always nuances in these arguments. But this was in many ways the beginning of the far right in Ireland because these people, rather than being listened to, were ridiculed. And we see this cycle sort of repeating throughout time.
And I think that kind of brings us up to the present day where and it's one for another day because I'm just conscious we've got an enormous amount of information that we've just shared there and it's amazing. But I think that a natural place to finish it is what the position of the people is in now that we're in this late stage of capitalism and imperialism, and we've got the background of climate collapse happening and the intensification of, we'll call it activity from this parasite class in terms of the release of the files now, and the genocides becoming more prolific, like Gaza. We see what they're doing now in Cuba. It feels like a long time ago since they kidnapped the president of Venezuela. What's happening now is a consolidation, and it's as though they feel confident that they have consolidated their position in this system, and people really, really urgently need to first recognize what this system is, and second, recognize the patterns throughout history to divide and dilute the power of the working class. Unity is the number one enemy of theirs, because if we're united, if the people at the bottom of this horrible system are united, we pose a real and actual threat. And we haven't posed a threat like that in a very long time. Like, we could go back to Ireland and Larkin and the lockout, where an awful lot of people's power was generated. There was a real wave of that, and it got crushed and it got usurped by this system. And we need to start looking back to the goals of those revolutionaries who really, really had the purest goals of the people in mind, which was a 32-county socialist republic. And I think maybe for another conversation, we could talk about what that unity looks like. We could talk about the present day division that's being stoked in Ireland. You have Steve Bannon outright saying he is going to have an Irish Trump. And you have the farmers at that conference over Mercosur saying that they should look to the US MAGA for inspiration. And then you have the same characters like Simon Harris and Micheál Martin posing as these level-headed centrists who sit in the middle of left and right to mediate. And as I said earlier, that is not what they are. They are agents. They are agents for this system. They are not level-headed centrist politicians. They are not. They are working for the elite of this system. Micheál Martin constantly says, I'm for enterprise. What does that mean? It means I am for the system. I am for the investors. I am not for the people. Let the invisible hand of the market take care of the people. We are non-interventionists. If we make the rich rich, they'll piss their wealth down on top of you. And won't that be enough for you? Trickle down economics. I just wanted to really make that clear, because I think it's the only logical place to end up with this conversation.
Yeah.
And kind of a taking back of power. Once the clarity of what this system is has kind of, set in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it is a great place to finish on, especially now we look at the real nature of this divide. We look at all of the work they've put into dividing us, and
Yes.
we see really we have one common enemy, and it's, really not as stratified or divided as you might think. It's a battle of a 1 or a 0.1% against everybody else at this point,
Yes.
and we need to look at these sort of places of unity, these struggles, I think, that we have a lot of alliances over. And, the first of which really begins with sovereignty. It begins with democracy on the grassroots level
Mhm.
and the ability for communities and for people to be able to make decisions for themselves and for their communities. It means being able to make decisions together over things that the government are trying to push through very undemocratically. It means
Mhm.
communities being able to have transparency over these direct provision centers and to have a degree of community engagement as to where these direct provision centers
Yeah,
are
like why
being
can't we
pushed
have
in
any
their
in
way.
Killiney? Why can't we have any in Dalkey? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, as in, I think that the working class get a reputation of being racist, and I don't think that's true at all. I think the most diverse communities are working class communities, where you
Uh-huh.
see some really beautiful community across all kinds of nationalities, and maybe the elites are the ones that are racist because why aren't they in their neighborhoods? What is their problem with them that they, you know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
um,
And you see now, I mean, even a lot of the things that would have almost divided, or they would have divided society in terms of people's position, let's say, on governments basically eroding our rights in terms of security, in terms of surveillance, in terms of just general right to life as a whole. And we see these just being slowly eroded. And there's like lots of places for us to unite on. One of which I think that's uniting a lot of the country now is around militarization, is
yeah.
not wanting our people getting sent to fight for these parasites,
This
you know?
system, this
Yeah,
is who we're fighting for. These are for what this is the industry that the only industry that profits from war is the one that is led by the people we're talking about here.
yeah.
And we really, really need that clarity.
Exactly.
Um,
And a couple of other small points now in Dublin, I see a lot of these stickers around the place about resisting digital currencies and trying to keep control of cash, because this is another thing that's being used to push through greater levels of control, is moving us away from being able to use cash and having to use these digital currencies. And these
yes.
can be very easily controlled and watched. And this is something else I think we all need to be uniting behind over. We have
Hmm.
this CETA about corporations reserving the right to sue the Irish government for infringing on their profits. We have the Irish government trying to push through the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which would make me and you and half the country, if
Criminals.
not more, criminals for criticizing the state of Israel, conflating that with anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
You have at the same time the use of this checkpoint software across Irish institutions, including hospitals, including police forces, etc. Um, and you see these things as things that should unite the country. And what do we also see, given the level of British complicity and intelligence collecting and evil that they have been responsible for in the north? And this actually, Kincora, the main victims were Protestant children,
Yeah.
And these are victims on the island of Ireland. And I feel we can now better acknowledge the north of Ireland as a front line in the fight against these people and these
Yeah.
networks, just like we can do the same as Palestine, just like we can do the same for Cuba. These are all front lines against this imperialist network being run by parasites. And
Hmm.
these are all struggles we should be uniting behind if we are to resist the end goals of their plan, which are basically destruction on a level that the Earth has likely not seen since the dinosaurs went extinct.
Yeah,
So
it's
these
not.
are all things we need to get
Mhm.
behind, and perhaps to go through again emails and what we can learn about their ideology, their plans. And we finished the last episode on Palantir.
Mhm.
Maybe we can do the same today, in that the British government, just gave their biggest ever military contract to Palantir, which is now going to be active in the north of Ireland, where
Yeah.
they already have a completely sectarian police force in the PSNI who stop and search and arrest basically two Catholics for every Protestant, you
Yeah.
know? So we see who the targets of these networks are going to be
Of
already.
course.
It's going to be the poor, it's going to be the working class, it's going to be anyone who resists empire in any way. And we still have a window of opportunity before it's too late. But as
Before
we
it's too
see
late,
with
and that's
Palantir
key.
now, moving in, and some have speculated that Palantir are going to essentially replace the need for an Epstein in this network because of
Yeah.
all of the data they're going to be able to and can already access through Palantir is something that should be terrifying all of us. And I think an example of this, even right now in Greenland, where you have Greenland, who's one of the architects of the US aggression towards Greenland, this person we mentioned in
Lauder,
the first episode, Lauder, right?
Estee Lauder linked.
Yes,
Yeah.
Denmark have already signed contracts with Palantir, you know? So
And
like they've
Ghislaine Maxwell
already
paved the
moved in there.
way for this idea of exploiting the resources of the Arctic. They're rushing for the most amount of resources in the system and to control the problem of the poor. So maybe in the future, in another podcast, we can talk about what their plans are for the future and how we can mobilize against that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this will give, people have a lot to think about after this episode, and a lot of information. And thank you so much for your incredible research, Dara, on this. I think it has made clear that far from being isolated from this system, Ireland is a keynote. And we have got to stop our pattern of only being able to recognize things with hindsight. And we've got to be able to do it in the present day, even if it means ostracism. I mean, ostracism from who? The likes of Eilish O'Hanlon in The Independent, who's defending George Mitchell. Like, yeah. So thank you so much, Dara, and we will be back again soon.
Cheers, Audrey. Bye bye.
Bye.